I'm Richard Land, and we are here. Brian McLaren and I are here. We want to introduce ourselves. Brian, introduce yourself to those who may not have heard our previous blog.
Certainly. Well, my name is Brian McLaren. I live just outside of Washington, D.C. I'm married to a wonderful lady named Grace. We have 4 adult kids. I was a pastor for over 20 years. The last few years I've been working as an author and speaker and networker. If you're interested in my website and blog, it's brianmclaren.net, BrianMclaren.net. And how about you, Richard?
I'm Richard Land. I, for 20 years now, have been the head of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is the public policy and religious liberty advocacy arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. I've been married for just over 37 years. I met my wife in seminary. She was 2 years ahead of me in seminary, and she has a Ph.D. in marriage and family, as in private practice as a marriage and family therapist. We have 3 grown children. I live in Franklin, Tennessee, which is just outside of Nashville. And my website is richardlandlive.com and faithandfamily.com, and Brian and I both blog at Casting Stones, and we're delighted that you're joining us today for our discussion together. Brian, I'm going to let you start off the questioning this time.
Well, great. Well, Sarah Palin's been in the news in a big way in recent days. And I know your sense, Richard, is that she has greatly energized the Republican base. And why do you think she has helped close the enthusiasm gap in this election?
Well, I do think she has, and it's not just the Republican base, it's sort of the social conservative base. I've gotten scores of emails and phone calls from both Catholic and Protestant pro-life women particularly. I think that she has tapped into something deeper than you and I as males may be able to fully understand. I thought about the fact that when she was introduced by Senator McCain last Friday, she got sustained applause when she mentioned Geraldine Ferraro and Hillary Clinton. I don't know anyone else that could have gotten that kind of applause for those 2 figures at a McCain for President event. I think the fact that she is so strongly pro-life, that she is, as one of the Catholic women that I know from the pro-life movement said to me, she said, I can't tell you what it means to me to have an attractive, pro-life mother of 5 as the person who is going to be one of the chief spokespersons for the pro-life movement in coming months. I think also the fact that she has decided to have and keep her 5th child, a Down syndrome child, has really it shows that she's authentically pro-life. She doesn't just talk pro-life; yeah. She lives pro-life. And that kind of integrity, I think, really resonates with people. I'll tell you, I have women who work for me in my office who are just giddy.
Yeah.
I mean, giddy's the only word, and these are not ladies who are normally giddy. I mean, they're giddy about this, and so I think that it has helped to close the enthusiasm gap.
I'm interested in your comment about getting applause for Hillary Clinton and Geraldine Ferraro. Mm-hmm. Tell me what you think was going on in that, because that was probably a crowd that would be very reticent to applaud either of those women.
I don't think anyone else could have gotten them to applaud her. I think that this has tapped into something that is deeper than just politics. It goes back to the sisterhood. Mm. I mean, I saw Geraldine Ferraro saying on television the other day that she is at least considering voting for John McCain because of his pick of Sarah Palin. I think that there is this question has come up, and I'd like to get your answer to it. The question of whether sexism or racism is more pervasive in our culture. Yeah. And Susan Estrich, who is Mondale's campaign manager, says that she thinks that sexism may not be more pervasive than racism, but it's more overt, that people still express it more in our society. Now, I know it's a little unseemly for 2 white males to be talking about this issue, but we're at least entitled to have an opinion about it. What do you think?
Well, first, it's interesting. I think we all live in worlds that can be very self-reinforcing. So while you've seen nothing but enthusiasm for Sarah Palin, I would say my parents really like her, but I haven't met anybody else in my circle of friends who's nearly that enthusiastic about her. I personally think she comes off extremely likable, and my first impression of her was not terribly positive when when Senator McCain introduced her. I went, probably like a lot of people, I went on the internet and tried to learn more about her, and saw her in a debate when she was running for governor, and I was much more impressed with her seeing her in that debate setting, and have tried to learn a bit more about her. But I would have to say, this might be one of those things where this really strengthens the Republican base, and certainly strengthens people who are deeply pro-life and were disappointed in McCain that he hasn't energized that base as well. But I think an awful lot of other people have seen this as a kind of a strange. There's just been a strange emotion involved with it. Some of it, I imagine, is sexism, as you say, Richard, and I think there is something that resonates in women, especially if the only image of a professional woman who's out working, making a very public contribution in our world, if the only image is kind of a politically liberal woman, or a woman who's chosen not to have children, or maybe has one child, I can really see how Sarah Palin would exemplify a different model and would open up an awful lot, for other people. But I thought I came across this one. Let's see if I can find it here. I came across a quote from, maybe you've seen this, from Mark DeMoss, who was former chief of staff to Jerry Falwell.
I haven't seen it, so I'll look forward to hearing it.
Yeah, I'll just read that. Here's what he said in this quote. I think reflects what a lot of my circle of friends would feel. Too many evangelicals and religious conservatives are too preoccupied with values and faith and pay no attention to competence. We don't apply this approach to anything else in life, including choosing a pastor. He went on to say, imagine if a church was searching for a pastor and the leadership brought in a candidate with great values but little experience. He said, they've been a pastor for 2 years at a church with 150 people, but he shares our values, so we hired him to be the pastor of our 5,000-person church. He said, we would be looking for competence beyond values, even in hiring a pastor. And then he goes on to say, that this doesn't, we ought to be sure to pay a lot of attention to competence.
Now, when did he say this?
I'd have to do a little more Googling to find it.
Because I know that Mark was very supportive of Mitt Romney. And that sounds like something he was saying when people were just rejecting Mitt Romney out of hand because of his Mormonism. I am not one of those people.
Yeah.
I do know evangelicals who say they could not have voted for Mitt Romney. I am not one of them, particularly after his speech at the President Bush 41 library in College Station, where he, I think, delineated very clearly that the church's authority over him would extend only to church matters.
Yeah.
But no, I agree with the statement that we can't just go for people who agree with us on values, that there has to be a competence expressed. I actually, my wife's response, my wife is not the most demonstrative person. They say opposites attract, and I'm sort of an extroverted extrovert, and my wife is sort of an introverted introvert. But she said to me, after watching Sarah Palin, she said, I thought that Sarah Palin was what the feminist movement was supposed to be about. A woman who's able to be a wife and a mother and have a career too.
Yes, and it has been interesting watching this debate fly back and forth. I have not been able to watch the news very much lately, and have just had a bit of opportunity to do a little reading on the internet. So I haven't actually seen what I understand from you and from others is that a lot of quote, liberal people have been attacking Sarah Palin. And I haven't seen that. I've heard the media reporting on people doing that. I haven't actually seen it. But I think this is a fascinating moment, isn't it? Because in one sense, Barack Obama represents everything that traditional white America wants people to do. And in a sense, Sarah Palin represents everything that progressive, democratic America wants women to do. Mm-hmm. And so it's a fascinating opportunity for people to have to
well, it is.
To face some of our deep prejudices, as you said.
Well, it is. And, as you know, from studying history, social change doesn't happen incrementally. It usually happens, It sort of reaches a tipping point, and then it just sort of like water going over a levee.
Yes.
And that's what's happened in this election. We've been hearing that America is getting more diverse. It's getting less white. It's getting more ethnically diverse. And you've had more and more women entering the workplace. I mean, Sarah Palin's 45 years old, which, is that generation. It's normal for women to be involved in the workforce. And I think what we've seen is that it's no accident that we've had these two historic candidacies take place in the same election cycle. I mean, it shows that America is a democracy. It is a representative democracy. And as more and more Americans are more and more diverse, it was only a matter of time before we quit having just white males running for president and vice president. And so you have this, in the same election cycle, you have the first African American nominated by a major party. And, I haven't met anyone personally who's not thrilled by that. The fact that on the 45th anniversary of Dr. King's speech at the National Mall in front of the Lincoln Memorial, the I Have a Dream speech, we have an African American nominated for president, and then we now have a woman in the week of the 88th anniversary of the passage of women's suffrage. We have the second woman to be nominated by a major party for the vice presidency. And I think it reflects the fact that, sometimes it takes America a while to live up to our founding promises, but we continue to progressively do so.
Let me make an observation on this, Richard, then I'd be interested in your thoughts on it. First, I think it's going to be very interesting for the evangelical Christian community, the vast majority of which still will not allow women leaders in their church. I wonder if if Sarah Palin is widely supported by evangelicals, as it appears she will be because of her pro-life stance and her other positive attributes. I wonder if this will have an effect on weakening the opposition to women in leadership in the church on the one side. And then another observation. I wonder if part of the negative reaction to Sarah Palin on the behalf of more progressive people is they're not used to seeing Republicans be bold and take big steps like this. And maybe there's a little feeling that, hold it, breaking barriers is our turf, not their turf.
Well, let me take the second one first, Brian. I think that there's a little, especially in the blogosphere, there's a little of the same reaction you had to Clarence Thomas. You're getting the same reaction to Sarah Palin. This is our ball game. We're the ones who are for feminists.
Yeah.
We're the ones who are for equal rights for women. And Sarah Palin has been a longtime member of Feminists for Life, which is an interesting organization. I was asked to speak at one of their meetings, and it's a mostly younger demographic of women who want equal rights and who are strongly speaking up for equal rights, but don't see the pro-choice position as the truly feminist position. And I think that there's a lot of the people, particularly sort of the hard left bloggers, are just as outraged by Sarah Palin as they were by Clarence Thomas. Now, on the first question, it's interesting, Brian. You're not the first person to ask me that question. I've had two reporters ask me, they say, well, now, Dr. Land, the Southern Baptist Convention is officially on record in its confession as saying that women are not to be pastors of churches and that the husband is to be the head of the home. How does this reconcile with massive support, it seems, for Sarah Palin for vice president? And I said, well, I'm really glad you asked the question. It gives me an opportunity to clarify. First of all, we don't believe biblically that women are to be an authority in the local church. Now, as a Baptist, that only extends to the local church. So, for instance, the head of our Washington office for several years before she had to resign because of the needs of a special needs child was a woman. because the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission is not a church. And so we have no problem with women being involved in ministry roles outside being pastor of the church. Secondly, the Bible says the husband is to be the head of the home. And, I suspect that in Sarah Palin's home, it's somewhat like it was with Mrs. Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher said that she was the head of the country, and Dennis Thatcher, her husband, was the head of the home. And Queen Elizabeth, when asked about it, said, Prince Philip is the head of our home, and I'm the queen of the country. I must tell you, Brian, in the circles in which I travel, there have been many wistful moments when people have said, oh, don't you wish we could have an American Margaret Thatcher? Well, we may have found her.
Well, that's, again, I think, as you say, there's a lot of diverse opinion on that. I do think, though, it will make it harder to, I think it will create a social wind that will make the churches refusing to allow women leaders. I just think it's going to raise a lot of questions and probably reopen that issue in a lot of churches. Well,
it may in a lot of churches. I don't think it will in the Southern Baptist life, because we make it as crystal clear as we can that this has nothing to do with equality or inequality, that men and women are equal. It has to do with the role that God has assigned in two institutions, and two institutions only. One being the family and one being the church. But in the church in which Sarah Palin comes from, the Assemblies of God Church, they have no restrictions on women participating in ministry. As you know, Pentecostalism has had some of the more charismatic leaders in that whole movement have been women. So I don't think it'll be an issue in that denomination or in that movement. Brian, I'd like to ask you a question. I am told that there was that you participated in an advertisement sometime during the Saddleback Forum, in which you were expressing your admiration for Barack Obama. Now, I'd like to know, first of all, are you endorsing Senator Obama? And if so, do you think that pastors and ministers should do so?
Yeah, well,
did you do so when you were in the pastorate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was on an advertisement that was paid for by Matthew 25 Network supporting Senator Obama, that did play during the Saddleback Forum. And this is the first time I've ever been highly involved in an election. I think I voted in every election since I was 18, but I've never gotten involved in an election. Part of the reason is because this is my first presidential election outside of the pastorate. Now, I wouldn't say I think it's wrong for pastors to endorse candidates, because I think there are just many different situations. For example, African American churches have traditionally had pastors who are highly involved in politics, and I would not want to criticize them for doing that. I think it makes a whole lot of sense. But I, as a pastor, I never made public who I was voting for. I'm embarrassed to say this. I'm not proud of this, what I'm about to say. For many years, I think I just stayed away from politics entirely because I just didn't want to cause any trouble. That was part of it. Part of it was I wasn't paying that much attention. I was busy raising children and leading a local church. But when I left the pastor 2.5 years ago, I felt a lot of freedom I hadn't felt. I didn't want to be a divisive figure in my church. I wanted to make sure the main thing was the main thing, which for me is inviting people to be true followers and disciples of Jesus. But as a pastor, out of the pastorate, I felt a lot more freedom to be involved. So this is my first election as a civilian, I guess you could say, and so that's why I've been involved in using whatever voice I have for Senator Obama.
Well, my story is somewhat the reverse of yours. I came to political involvement early. I was the junior high school campaign manager for Richard Nixon in 1960 in my junior high school.
Is that
when I was in the 8th grade, and I campaigned 18 nights as a volunteer as a high school senior for Barry Goldwater in 1964 in southeast Houston against the Texas president. I had people turn dogs on me and hoses on me and make suggestions to me that showed that they had vivid imaginations but limited knowledge of human anatomy. And I stayed pretty much involved in the political process until I came to the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission in 1988, and I took a totally voluntary and completely unsolicited vow of not endorsing candidates because, I'm the head of an agency that is a denomination.
Yeah.
And the exit polls tell us that 4 out of 5 Southern Baptists voted for George Bush in the last presidential election, but 20% didn't.
Yeah.
And I have a responsibility to try to minister to all of them.
Yeah.
And so I personally don't think that pastors should be endorsing candidates. And it's interesting that Dr. King never endorsed a candidate.
Yeah.
He was very much involved in the public policy process and was calling both parties to account. But he never endorsed a candidate. And I would say even in the African-American context, if Dr. King could be as involved and active as he was in public policy without ever endorsing candidates, that African-American ministers ought to be able to do so as well. But let me add one more caveat, and that is I don't think the government should be in the business of restricting what churches can do. I think that ought to be a church decision, but I don't think churches should do it. I strenuously urge churches and pastors of churches not to endorse candidates, but instead to be informing their people about what the Bible has to say about moral issues, encouraging people to be registered, and then have them vote their own values. You can't connect the dots for people. I think that's the line you can't cross. Yeah. You have to leave it to people to connect their own dots.
We did something in the church where I pastored at the last presidential election. A few weeks before the election, we had 4 members of our congregation, and looking back, I probably should have had more, but we had 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and we had an open forum where they could share reasons why they were voting as they were, why they held the party affiliation they did. They could ask questions back and forth of each other, and then the congregation got to ask questions of them. And I felt good about that because I felt like what we did is we tried to model as a congregation respectful dialogue, as you and I are trying to do, as I know you're very committed to from your book, and as you know I'm committed to as well. So we tried to model that kind of respectful dialogue, and I think that also was positive because instead of having the pastor kind of blow the trumpet and say this is the way it is, I as a pastor tried to make sure that the voices of the congregation were engaging in intelligent interaction on the election. But, for me, this time around, it was one of those situations. Obviously, it's a risk. It's something I'd never done. But I felt enough was at stake that I decided to take the risk, and this will be a learning process for me. There's an awful lot about election processes that just turn my stomach and make me sick. So it's not like I'm terribly have a high level of affection for all of this.
Well, as we talked last time we were together, we have to always understand that when you're talking about the church, and I'm speaking now of the church in its invisible brotherhood and sisterhood of all believers, and parties and politics, you're mixing the sacred with the profane. You're mixing the sacred with the earthly. That political parties are no better than they have to be, and that they will exploit and they will manipulate and they will use people if they can do so. And so it's really up to people of faith to make sure they don't get manipulated in the process. Now,
Richard, can I make a comment on that?
Sure.
I know that we're supposed to try to find some areas of disagreement, but I really want to agree with what you just said. And I think it's especially interesting this week because as all of this debate goes back and forth about Sarah Palin and all the rest, each party is going to spin everything they can spin, and one of the negative consequences of this is it can keep us from taking seriously the deeper issues that are there, either because the other party has said it and we don't want to agree, or because our party has said the opposite. What I'm thinking of especially is to the degree that there is a lot of latent sexism out there. Boy, this week is an opportunity for people to really face that latent sexism. and to the degree there's maybe subtle and unexpressed overtly racism, now becomes an opportunity for us to really try to face that underneath all of the noise of party spin. And probably that's an important job for pastors and other spiritual leaders, to try to help us get through the static and get down to some of those deeper issues. Our nation could be a much better nation in a couple of months because of the important self-reflection and dialogue that happens.
Well, I think that's true, and I must say that I have been, I never, Brian, I never thought I would feel sorry for Hillary Clinton. But I have, at times, been felt a great deal of sympathy for her, because I felt that she really didn't get a fair shake from a lot of the media, and that a lot of it was just, well, I don't know any other word for it, but sexist.
Yeah.
I thought, gosh, I thought we were beyond this. But I heard commentators, I must confess, mostly males, mostly white, who were just engaging in what I don't have any other word for but sexism. And then now, I don't think all of the criticism of Sarah Palin has been sexist.
Yeah.
I think there are legitimate questions to ask about her record and about her preparation. But when you start saying, well, who's going to care for her children?
Yeah.
No one asked Barack Obama that question.
That's exactly right.
I mean, that's a sexist question on its face. That's just a sexist question.
And that maybe helps us get a better definition of sexism, because a lot of people, when they hear a word like sexism or racism, they assume there's some kind of vicious intent. And there doesn't have to be any dark, vicious intent. There can just be an unfairness. And so if somebody's willing to ask a question like that of Sarah Palin and they don't ask it of Barack Obama, then we see some unfairness, even if they don't have any anger or misogyny underneath it.
No, I think, to be honest with you, I think most of it has been ignorance.
Yeah.
But, ignorance is hurtful.
Yeah.
And most prejudice is a result of ignorance to begin with.
So so part of this controversy maybe, on a rare moment, helps us all to become a little bit aware of our ignorance.
But now, Brian, I'd like to go to another topic that I have had 5 or 6 different discussions on, and I know you're going to have an opinion about this, and that is the change in the Democratic Party platform on abortion.
Yeah.
Your friend and my friend Jim Wallace says this is a historic step in the right direction, although he acknowledges that he didn't get everything he wanted.
Yeah.
And then there are others, most notably Naomi Schaefer Riley, writing in the Wall Street Journal, who says that the platform actually moved to the left of where it was in 2004. Did you have any input, or do you know any people that had input into that platform process? And do you think the platform that was adopted by the Democratic Party is more open to the pro-life position than the one that they had in 2004?
Yeah, well, let me say a couple of things about that. First, no, I didn't have any input on that at all. But I believe Tony Campolo was quite involved, and he's been working hard to get the Democrats to pay more attention to the significant percentage of Democrats who are pro-life. Just to summarize for people who haven't had a chance to look at it, and I hadn't seen it until your office sent it to me, and I believe it is available now. It was hard to get recently, but if people Google it, they can download it. And if they do download it, this is on page 50, and it's really a very short little paragraph. It says that the Democratic Party strongly supports Roe versus Wade, and they strongly support the right to choose a safe and legal abortion. And then, so that's the status quo of the Democratic Party for a long time.
Now, Brian, could I interrupt you for a second? The copy that I have says that they strongly and unequivocally support. Now, have they taken that back out?
No, that may be true. I'm not reading from the actual text. I'm reading from notes that I took.
Because unequivocally, I mean, that's one of the points that Senator Obama is quite correct when he says words matter.
Yeah.
And unequivocally, as you know, you're a wordsmith. You make your living using words. Unequivocally is a pretty comprehensive and inclusive word.
I'm not certain of this, but I imagine that's exactly the kind of word that Tony Campolo and others were trying to get out, because what that does...
And the thing is, it wasn't in the 2004 platform.
Yeah. What that does is it sends a message to the Democrats who who'd like to see a change here, that they're a marginalized minority. So that to me is unfortunate. What is a positive step, it seems to me, is they talk about. Then they say they're for family planning services and sex education. Again, I don't think that's a change. But then they say that these things will help reduce the need for abortion, and then they say they support the decision to have a child and programs that will facilitate adoption and so on. Now, when I read this, I felt that this was a very small crack in the door for the Democrats. For example, one of the things I noticed is abortion is called a right. But that word right doesn't come up elsewhere. So, to put all this in terms of rights, it seems to me is it's still obviously leaning very, very strongly in one direction. On the other hand, even for Republicans, people who have nothing much good to say about Democrats, I hope they can at least appreciate that there is a little bit of movement happening, happening by acknowledging that there are an awful lot of Democrats who are not in any way cavalier about abortion, and because even though they don't believe it should be criminalized, they believe there should be as few as possible. So,
yeah, first of all, I want to applaud those people who were involved in the process, who were trying to move the plank in a more pro-life direction. I applaud Tony Campolo and all the others who were working on that. And I do think there's a certain moral symmetry to, if you're going to say that every woman should have a right to an abortion regardless of her ability to pay, which means taxpayer subsidized abortions, that you ought to also be equally willing to subsidize those women who make the choice to have their children and to avail themselves of support services. It seems to me that they took a step forward and a step back at the same time. As I said, that word unequivocally supports, and then it goes on to say that we oppose any and all efforts to weaken or undermine that right. Now, I read that as saying that they would even be opposed to the ban on partial birth abortion, because it says any and all. Any and all, as you know, are very inclusive. And also, to me, the most disturbing thing was they took out the sentence that they had in the 2004 platform, which said that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, which was, of course, the mantra that Bill Clinton used. And, look, I want to be as clear as I can on this. I long for the day when both parties are pro-life, and the only difference of opinion is the best way to be pro-life. That's the way we are on the race issue. I mean, both parties are for racial justice and racial reconciliation. There are still some fairly deep philosophical disagreements about the best way to achieve that. I mean, for instance, I guess you're probably going to disagree with me about this, but I thought that one of the most eloquent statements made by Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court in recent years was the one made by Chief Justice Roberts when they ruled that you cannot bus people to require, just for the purposes of racial balance. He said the best way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. And that people were being discriminated against on the basis of their race, in this case, white students who were not being allowed to attend a neighborhood school because they needed to bus them to another location in order to achieve racial balance. Now, I understand the philosophy behind the busing movement, but I also think that at some point you have to say you ought to stop discriminating on the basis of race. And I want to give a kudo, at least one kudo, to Senator Obama. Because when he talks about affirmative action programs, he said, and by the way, I think that affirmative action programs that are based on race end up perpetuating or increasing racism. But he said that he was open to having affirmative action programs that would be based on economic deprivation, not racial deprivation. Now, as you and I both know, in many cases, those are going to be synonymous. For instance, in the University of Michigan situation, if they had used economic status instead of race, it would have only reduced the African American component in the law school by 2%. And I think most Americans, at least a majority of Americans, a consensus of Americans, would be willing to say, you know, if you've got two students, one comes from an upper middle class background, had a doctor for a father, and the other one comes from a working class blue collar background, and they have approximately equal SAT scores. You might want to give a little bit of a bonus to the kid who's from the working class background because he's not had the same level of opportunity. That takes the racial component out of it. As Barack Obama says, he says, I don't think that my daughters should be given a preference because of the color of their skin, because they've had, you know, advantages that many people in this country don't have. I think that's a much more constructive way to deal with the remaining inequalities in our society and would help a great deal to diffuse the racial tensions. What do you think?
Well, Richard, I partially agree with you, but I think you might agree with me on this. I think one of our problems is that we often rush to say that a program is good or bad, evil or just, when there are a lot of other possibilities. For example, it could be wise for a time, but not wise long term. You know, it could be the best option we figured out, maybe not the best possible. It could for me, some of these issues. You know, to have a debate in 2008 about this is very different than talking about it in 1968 or 1978.
Oh, I would agree with that. I would agree with that completely.
So then it really becomes a fascinating. This is one of the really important roles of good governance and good leadership, is not only talking about what's right or wrong, but also talking about what's timely. And those are judgment calls. And it does require good judgment and experience in leaders to continually be open-minded enough to say, you know, that was a great idea for the last 20 years, but it's time to change. Now, I would think that that's apropos on some issues relating to fossil fuels, for example, and other people might disagree. But I think that's something we have to continually monitor. I know that some of my critics they think that the word postmodern only means morally relativistic, etc. But one of the insights, I think, of a lot of postmodern scholars is that you sometimes need to deconstruct a law in order to get to justice. And that, I think, is another way of saying what we're saying. You can have a law that helped you get to justice 30 years ago, and now it needs to be changed because it's in the way of another kind of a better justice emerging.
Or we have seen, you know, an unforeseen consequence. A lot of times there are unforeseen consequences. For instance, I can't imagine that anyone who put together those huge housing projects in our inner cities foresaw the consequences.
That's exactly right.
And now we've adapted and are doing dispersed assisted housing, which I think is going to have far better consequences. Same thing with, you know, no one foresaw when we had the Civil Rights Revolution. One of the negatives of that is that African Americans who were middle class were assimilated into the larger culture, and they left behind neighborhoods that had a lot of the life and the vitality and the structure sucked out of them, and helped to create what appears to be a semi-permanent underclass that we're having difficulty trying to break through and to help people achieve more of the American dream. You know, those are unforeseen consequences, and I think one of the unforeseen consequences of many affirmative action programs is that it perpetuates prejudice. People who get passed over because even though they have higher test scores, because they happen to be white or male, if they weren't prejudiced before, there's a tremendous temptation to become prejudiced later. And even more importantly, the one best argument against either sexism or racism is achievement. Go out there and prove people wrong. And when people do that, many people unfortunately assume, well, they didn't compete on a level playing field. They had some assistance from affirmative action programs, and it denies the best weapon that people had to deny prejudice, which was achievement and excellence. So I really like, and look, I know that Obama has received some real criticism within the African American community for being willing to look at alternative ways of looking at affirmative action. But I applaud him for it because he's thinking outside the box, and I think that he had to react against a good deal of pressure to do it.
Richard, this to me is extremely important discussion. I wonder if I could go back before we wrap it up today to the issue of abortion. I wrote a couple of paragraphs in my most recent book about this, and I wondered if I could just read this and then get your comment on it.
Okay.
This is from a book I wrote called Everything Must Change, and here's what I said. Nobody, as far as I know, thinks abortion is good. By that I mean not even the most committed pro-choicer sets out to have an abortion. You might hear people defend abortion as a legal right, but you never hear anyone say, I can't wait to get pregnant so I can have an abortion, the way they would say, I can't wait to get a raise so I can buy a new car. Some might say that abortion is harmless, morally neutral, or not a lot different from cutting off an overgrown fingernail. More would say that abortion should be available as the lesser of two evils or the better option among other undesirable options. But nobody says the more abortions, the better. Putting rape-induced pregnancy aside, abortion is considered necessary because some people contract a pregnancy they don't want in the process of seeking pleasure, intimacy, and other consequences of intercourse that they do want. They know what causes pregnancy, so in that sense, they don't get pregnant by accident. But the pregnancy feels accidental because it was not the goal of their sexual activity. They could have chosen abstinence, they could have used birth control, they could have chosen a better partner with whom they would have wanted to raise a child, or they could have waited for a more auspicious time to have sex. But in spite of the many pre-pregnancy options at their disposal, they chose to engage in life's only pregnancy-causing activity while hoping to avoid the outcome. Then when they discover themselves pregnant, abortion presents itself as a way of fixing the undesired consequence of their desired behavior. Now, I go on after that to talk about a number of other areas in our culture where I think we do the same thing. And I suggest that all of these follow from a script taught by the covert curriculum of our culture in 1,000 ways. Namely, we can engage in pleasurable or profitable behaviors with undesired consequences and either avoid the consequences or clean them up later. Now, sorry for reading that for so long, but this to me is an underlying issue, this idea that we can create consequences and clean them up later, that people like you and I, who are religious leaders, we have a job, I think, to teach people this biblical concept of wisdom, that we've got to stop creating the mess to begin with.
Well, of course, I agree with that. I mean, certainly the last part of what you said, I think that, I've said all along that men are more pro-choice than women in virtually every segment of our society. And the reason is that too many men look upon a pregnant woman as a damaged partner, and that they look at abortion as the way to escape responsibility for irresponsible actions, of which, surely all adults know that one of the consequences of sexual intercourse can possibly be a pregnancy. And it seems to me that we as a society have a responsibility to say, no, there are certain consequences to certain actions. And I think we as religious leaders need to be talking about the fact that God created sex. As you know, 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul has the most stinging criticism of casual sex. Yeah. He says that God created the sexual union to make of two people one person, and that people who engage in sexual intercourse with another person become part of that person, whether they recognize it or not, whether they acknowledge it or not, whether they are aware of it or not. And that, as you and I both know, that the more promiscuous you are before marriage, the less likely you are to have a successful marriage. And the reason, I would argue, that the Apostle Paul is saying that a person who is engaged in sexual activity with 5 or 6 people is a different person than a person who has remained chaste until marriage.
Yeah.
And the honeymoon gets a little crowded when the average American male now has 8 sexual partners before he gets married, and the average American woman has 4. Well, if the Apostle Paul's right, and I believe he is, that means there are about a dozen people on that honeymoon. It gets a little crowded.
Different kind of multiple personality disorder, I guess.
Indeed.
Well, to me, this is really a good point to bring together a lot of the different topics we've talked about, because we've got to. I think part of this deep subject of wisdom in Scripture calls us to not just talk about consequences, but to talk about the unanticipated or undesired consequences, and to help people learn to think ahead. And so this is, to me, one of my great concerns in this political year, election year, is that we realize that even the kinds of debate that we engage in, the kinds of attack of opponents and all the rest, there are consequences of those behaviors. And even if one party or the other wins, boy, there are wounds left over. And I hope that we'll do our best to keep those unintended consequences in mind.
I think we have to, as people of faith, we have to set the example. And, you and I both know that I will get criticism for having given Senator Obama credit for being willing to be flexible and to think outside the box when it comes to affirmative action programs. And you will probably be criticized for not falling head over heels in love with the Democratic Party's plank on abortion. But I think it's our responsibility to not allow the parties or the people who are advocating various candidates to put us in a box.
Yeah.
I think people of faith have to tell the truth as we see it.
This is one,
and that's not going to fit neatly with either party's platform.
That's right, and this is exactly right. I was thinking about it watching people on television at the 2 conventions, and I'm sure that every Democrat who was there in Denver, there were moments where they thought, I'm so glad to be an American, and I'm so glad to be a Democrat. And I'm sure there are many moments this week in St. Paul where people are saying, I'm so glad to be an American. I'm so glad to be a Republican. And there are good things in being an American and being a Republican or Democrat. But then here's this danger that good things can become idolatrous. And so we're always trying to call people to a higher standard.
Well, that's right. I mean, we have to always remember, as people of faith, that our ultimate allegiance belongs to no one but the Lord Jesus Christ.
That's right.
And we have to follow His leadership in our lives, and we have to understand, and I keep saying this over and over to my conservative friends, I believe in the inerrancy and the infallibility of God's Word. I am not as confident of the inerrancy and infallibility of my understanding of God's Word. There's always a gap between the revealed truth and our human understanding of that revealed truth.
Yeah. Well, Richard, I think that's a good, profound note to end on. Probably all of us ought to keep that statement in mind, not only about our interpretation of Scripture, but all of our opinions. We all can be wrong, and that's one of the good reasons for dialogue. We can sharpen each other and challenge each other's thinking. So it's been a pleasure.
You bet. I've enjoyed it.
Keep up the good work. We'll talk to you soon.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.